All this week in the podcast, we've been thinking about what do we do when we can't see the whole picture, when we have big dreams and goals and ambitions that kind of feel a little bit impossible. And we're going to wrap up this whole week of, if you've been listening along all week, and if you haven't, incidentally, if you haven't been listening along all week, I would encourage you to go right back to the start. You can find that Faith and Business Playground /FAB123 is episode 1. It's not episode 1, it's episode 123, but it's the first one from this week. I'd encourage you to listen along because this week's episodes really are like a little mini series where I've been answering that question of what do we do when we can't see the whole picture, when our dreams feel impossible. And it culminates with this episode, because this episode is what I yesterday finished by calling the Easter Sunday episode, because at the time of release, the day this is published, it is Good Friday. And so I would wish you a very happy Easter. I know Good Friday is the solemn day. But I find it really hard to be solemn on Good Friday because we come to Easter with the benefit of Jesus tinted post-resurrection glasses. I haven't got a proper expression for it other than that. Because we know how this part of the story ends. It doesn't end on Good Friday, and so even though, and this does tie in with the conversation we've had this week, so bear with me, but with the disciples on that Good Friday, and they would have been, can you just imagine for a moment how devastated they would have been? Not just the disciples, Jesus' mother and the other ladies that were with her. It was a horrific day. Probably the very worst day in poor Mary's life. If you're listening to this and you're a parent, where you can get an inkling of how she must have been feeling. It's like any parent's worst nightmare, isn't it? But for us, as in 2019, Good Friday is like the preamble to Sunday. And so, yes, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. And this ties in with you and your goals and your ambitions and whatever that thing is that God's laid on your heart to be putting out there in the world. It ties in with that, because even if right now, today, you're feeling at rock bottom and you're feeling uncertain and you just don't know, Sunday's coming. And I mean that metaphorically, because God knows. God can see the big picture. When we can't see the big picture, and we can rarely see the big picture, sometimes we think we get inklings of the picture, but we rarely see the big picture, let's be honest. And so we can't see the big picture, but God can. I mean, God knew the big picture all the way back in eternity past, and he knew that we'd be here right now today in this moment, and he knew that you'd be where you are. Oof, that blows my mind. Just to think how that is even possible. It's possible because God is God. We're just these mere humans. Our brains can't compute it. But this reminder that if even, all of this week I've been trying to encourage you and giving you some practical steps and reminders. But if ultimately you get to the end of the week and you go, I don't know, I can't see the whole picture, it feels really difficult, I understand. Sunday's coming. There's an expression where it will all be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it means it's not the end. And I don't know who said that. And I don't know if ultimately it's biblical, because ultimately God knows that he will rule supreme and he is, seated on high and knows all things. So ultimately, it's all going to be okay. The bit in between, and that bit in between can last thousands of years, of course, is where you and I exist on this planet. So this idea that everything in your life ultimately will be okay isn't technically biblical, let's be honest. Ultimately, okay, let's use a really morbid example. Okay, if I was to drop down dead after recording this podcast episode, which if you're listening to this, you'll be glad to know I didn't, because before you can listen to this podcast episode, it has to be uploaded and I have to type some words into the computer. So be assured that I did not die immediately after recording this podcast episode by the mere fact that you're able to listen to this, just to say. But if by some freak accident I was to die after recording this podcast episode, it would feel like I imagine it would feel pretty devastating for the people who loved me. For me personally, it wouldn't be the end, because we believe in heaven and Jesus and resurrection and all that stuff that is over. I'm gesturing with my hands way off in the future somewhere, heaven and all that sort of stuff. So my ultimate end is good. Yeah, I know that ultimately it's all going to be okay. So we know that. However, there's nowhere in the Bible that says that your goals and ambitions are ultimately all going to be okay. We are told that God works for the good of those who love him. So, we hold on to these assurances. And I've reminded you earlier in the week of all those instances and all those assurances that God will never leave us. But there are people who love Jesus in the world today who are facing persecution, for example. There are people in the world today for whom everything is not okay. And so as much as I'm trying to encourage you and remind you, even if it's feeling difficult, Sunday's coming, and I do believe that, I feel a sense of responsibility to temper that with, it might get worse before it gets better, which doesn't feel like a very cheery conclusion to this week, but it feels like an honest conclusion, with the added assurance that ultimately God's got this. When we don't know what the next step is, when we don't know how it's all going to pan out, God's got it. God can see the big picture, and we are reminded continuously how loved we are. The whole of the Bible is a love story, ultimately. Jesus dying on Good Friday is a love story. And so if today is a day where you're like, just you're feeling a bit sort of like a deer in the headlights, paralyzed with inertia, I want to encourage you and remind you that Sunday is coming. It is going to be okay. I would encourage you to lean in, get support, and that feels like a reasonable time to remind you that I can help, faithandbusinessplayground.com/talk. But lean in. If you've got people around you, ask for help. You don't have to do this on your own. That's the other part of this as well, is that all of the people at the cross on Good Friday, they were in community. They were leaning on each other. The only person really on his own that day was Jesus. Even he said, my God, why do you forsake me? He was the person who felt most alone. And we know ultimately that he was cool. Yeah, he had a happy ending, because 3 days later we have Easter Sunday. So let's take encouragement from that. Let's take heart as we draw a neat bow on the end of this week where we've been thinking about those impossible dreams. Take your cue from Jesus. Jesus faced one of probably the worst moment in his life, felt completely alone and abandoned, but ultimately did it because you are loved. And ultimately, Sunday was coming, and your Sunday is coming too. Okay, excellent. I'm going to be back next week after Easter Sunday, so I do want to just take a moment to wish you a very happy Easter. And as ever, thank you for listening. It's always my pleasure to share this with you. Take care. Bye-bye.